This is a continuation of the reading of the book by Richard Hoskins called War Cycles, Peace Cycles. As this content is related to the broader scope of understanding macro and geopolitics, I felt this to be appropriate to include as part of the Interchain FM podcast. Enjoy.
Chapter 28. Bottom Side Transition Year. 1842. For the first time since 1814, commodity prices stopped going down. They didn't go up much, but they did stop going down. This was the bottom side transition year that brought to a close the first economic cycle since the country had been founded. The, quote, war phase of the second economic cycle was ushered in. 1844. Old debtors and new speculators started borrowing again. The money supply was up by 14%. This was good. The next year, the money supply was up only 6%. This was hardly enough to pay interest. Things got tight again. The United States started looking for something that would stimulate economic activity. Mexico warned the U.S. not to annex Texas. The U.S. annexed Texas. This was the stimulation needed. 1846. War with Mexico. The Mexicans ambushed an American detachment, killed 11, wounded 5, and captured the rest. The U.S. had been attacked. She declared war 18 days later. The initial preparations for war sent the money supply up 9%. The next year, it was up a hearty 16%. Times were looking good in the United States. 1848. Peace. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. It brought an end to the brief good times. The money supply was up only 4%. The following year, it wasn't up any at all, but gold had been discovered in California, and that made the difference. The gold rush was about to start. 1849. The usury banks at last elected their main president of the United States, Millard Fillmore of New York. This little-noticed event marks the year the office of the president passed into control of the banks and was used to advance their causes. It has remained in their hands ever since. The Congress was soon to follow. 1851. The gold flood from California started reaching the east. The money supply was up 19%. This was even better than the Mexican War. Octagonal $50 gold slugs minted by Muffet and Company of California circulated throughout the country. Every man without a job talked about going west to mine gold. Many did. This newly minted gold, for a time, short-circuited the bankers' usury contracts by creating the 11th dollar with which interest could be paid. These were gold tallies. Thousands of debtors paid their debts and got off the hook. For the first time, they owned their own farms. Others looked for still greener pastures. A group of filibusters were lent money by the banks and sailed from New Orleans to try to take Cuba away from debt-ridden Spain. 1853. The money supply was up 11%. The gold flood seemed never to end. William Walker invaded the debtor nation of Mexico and set up the short-lived Republic of Lower California. 1854. The Crimean War started. This resulted in war contracts going out in Russia, England, France, and Turkey. All the world benefited as this new flood of money was borrowed into existence. English and French rulers found themselves in a ticklish position. For hundreds of years, they had furnished crusades to fight the Saracens. Now they were making treaties with these very same Saracen heathen who were long-standing enemies of their own countries to fight against the Christian nation of Russia. Most Western history books of that period carry long explanations why the Christian rulers of France and Britain felt compelled to ally themselves with the Saracens. The thousands of British, French, and Russian wounded lying there on the battlefield of the Alma could only smile wanly at each other and repeat the one word that all understood: Christian. There were very few Mohammedans killed on the Allied side in the campaign, just Christians. The Queen City of Christendom, Constantinople, and 15 million Greek Samaritans were allowed to remain in Turkish hands. The purpose of the war was to help the economy and the banks, not to free people or their cities, and certainly not to ruin a potential borrower, Turkey. 1855. Time was running out. The gold flood slowed. There were no wars, no new money being borrowed into existence. Interest payments caused the money in circulation to contract by 2%. 1856. The money supply was up a trifling 2%. Hard times had arrived. Pump priming money flowed from the banking centers of the Northeast to a terrorist in Kansas. On the night of May 24th, this man, his 4 sons, and 3 others butchered 5 Southern sympathizers at Dutch Henry's Crossing at Potawatomi Creek. The men they killed were family men. They were taken unarmed from their homes at night, one at a time, had their arms hacked off, and were gutted. The case never came to trial. His name, John Brown. The terror of the French Revolution was spreading to American revolutionists. Tempers began to flare. John Brown was earning his pay. Brown professed to be a Christian. The closest thing we have today to compare with his theology are those certain Judeo-Christians who are saved by grace to do anything they want to do. 1857. Unemployment was rampant. Municipalities couldn't collect taxes to pay on their indebtedness. Defaults were beginning, most of which were in the North. Something had to be done to relieve the unbearable economic situation. Chicago and Philadelphia defaulted. So did Jefferson, Ohio. In Philadelphia, 10,000 workers met and demanded work. A public works program was set up. The Bank of Pennsylvania failed. Girard Bank suspended specie payments. Cedar County, Iowa, and Jefferson, Ohio defaulted their bonds. The Ohio Insurance Company went broke. 4,920 businesses failed. A record. 1858. Knox, Indiana defaulted. So did Rome, New York, Union, Ohio, Crawford County, Pennsylvania, and Johnson County, Iowa. John Brown, the Kansas killer, was brought east. He was financed by men in the very areas being squeezed in the Northeast. Sent to Virginia, he murdered 4 more men, setting passions aflame. The newspapers belonging to the banking interests of the Northeast called him a martyr. The relatives of the men he murdered were living in an area which had little debt. They did most of what little banking businesses did with England as their ancestors had for the previous 150 years. They said he was a murderer. An unknown backwoodsman was tapped to be the spokesman of the moneyed interests. He started making warlike noises. His name was Abraham Lincoln, an American Robespierre. 1859. Davis, Indiana defaulted its bonds. So did Lawrence County, Pennsylvania, and Janesville, Wisconsin. The money supply was up 7%. Still, 3,913 businesses failed. 1860. Kansas had a terrible drought and famine. This was compounded by raiders financed from the Northeast. New London, Connecticut defaulted. So did Hancock, Ohio, Bissell and Jeffersonville, Indiana, Beloit, Wisconsin, Butler County, Pennsylvania. Municipal debt had grown 10 times from 1840 to 1860, and the payments were becoming unbearable. As always, because of interest, there was far more money owed than was in existence. 3,675 businesses failed. Here are some more facts many history books filter out. The richest man and largest slave owner in Jefferson County, Virginia, was black. He owned 91 slaves. Another one, Charles Rogers, owned 47. Marie Manchester, also black, owned 58. Solomon Humphreys of Macon, Georgia, was the town's leading grocer, and John Jones was proprietor of one of Charleston's leading hotels. Tommy LaFawn of New Orleans was a prominent philanthropist. The city erected a bust in his honor in a public building. He, too, was African American. The assessed valuation of all United States property at this time was $12 billion, 1/2 in 11 southern states with only 8 million Caucasians. These 8 million Caucasians exported 57% of the total exports of the nation. The South was wealthy, had a debt-free citizenry, and really did not know that the usury centers of the Northeast were being devastated by a usury-induced depression. 1860. The straw that broke the camel's back occurred when the money supply declined 1%, putting pressure on debtors all over the Northeast. These poor people were enmeshed in the net of debt, which was drawing tighter and tighter. They were finding it impossible to pay $2,000 of debt with only $1,000 in circulation, as countless generations before have found. Nevertheless, they had to get interest payments somehow or lose everything they had. November 6, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Fearing the threats of Lincoln, South Carolina seceded on December 20th. Section 9. The War Between the States. Chapter 29. How it started. Early 1861, a whole flock of northern municipalities defaulted on their bonds. Schuyler, Illinois, Genoa, New York, Sterling, New York, Waterloo, Wisconsin, Rochester, Wisconsin, Marshall County, Iowa, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Before the year ended, 6,993 businesses had failed. William Henry Seward, Secretary of State, suggested a diversionary foreign war to reunite the country. It was a good idea, but Lincoln had other plans. March 15th. Assurances were given the Confederate government that Fort Sumter would be evacuated within a few days. March 28th. In spite of these assurances, Mr. Lincoln completed plans for fitting out an expedition to invade Charleston Harbor. April 5th. Transports and vessels of war with troops, munitions, and military supplies sailed from northern ports bound southward. April 6th. More ships set sail from northern ports to join the fleet. April 7th. Still more ships sailed from port to join forces. The newspapers picked up these warlike events and fully exposed them in Washington and elsewhere. The Southern peace delegation read these reports, became alarmed, and confronted the Lincoln government with the charge of deception. The Lincoln government pooh-poohed the whole matter and referred to the imminent evacuation in a note which said, "Faith as to Sumter fully kept. Wait and see." Unfortunately for Mr. Lincoln's reputation, this message was in writing. At the very same time the war fleet was on high seas, the Lincoln government continued to maintain that Fort Sumter would be peacefully handed over to South Carolina and there would be no war. April 10th. A message was sent from the Southern Carolina peace delegation in Washington to General Beauregard at Charleston. The Tribune of today declares the main object of the expedition to be the relief of Sumter, and that a force will be landed which will overcome all opposition. This was how South Carolina learned that a United States invasion fleet was shortly due to storm Charleston. April 12th. The fleet arrived but was kept out of Charleston Harbor by a terrible storm which upset the time schedule. The South Carolinians were now reduced to one of two choices: to allow the fleet and fort to combine forces and subdue the greatest commercial harbor in the South, or to reduce the fort before the storm died down and the fleet could enter. A choice of this kind is no choice at all. Naturally, they bombarded the fort and received the stigma of firing the first shot. Lincoln had won. The war was on. Contracts went out. Bank profits boomed as the money supply jumped to 11% versus minus 1% the horrible warless year before. 1862, bank profits skyrocketed as the money supply jumped another 25%. Happy days were here again. For the first time since 1854, money was freely flowing. It allowed the poor farmer to keep his farm, it allowed the hard-pressed businessman to pay the mortgage and keep his business, and it allowed people to pay their taxes, which kept cities from defaulting their bonds. This made the holders of those bonds happy indeed. The bloody war, which cost hundreds of thousands of lives, did have a silver lining. 1863. There were only 495 business failures. Lincoln has been blamed for the war. Of course, he gave orders, but the usury system had created hundreds of others who were capable of doing the same thing. There was Seward, who suggested a diversionary war. This would have accomplished the same thing economically that a civil war did. It was he who suggested the closing of southern ports to all trade except northern trade. These men were created by a system which demanded that money be borrowed into existence, whatever the cost, to relieve the suffering of the nation. Of course, for the sake of history, the reasons must be changed to be acceptable to future generations. It sounds better to fight to preserve the Union and to free the slaves than to fight to increase the money supply by 25%, giving debtors another chance to pay a $2,000 debt while only $1,000 is in circulation. The real reason, the thing that breaks strong men, turns women into work-worn hags and early widows and starved children, the wolf of interest, is never mentioned. The interest bankers who run the system selected Lincoln, a willing tool, and told him what to do. He broke almost every rule in the book. He started a war by himself without the approval of Congress. He jailed 38,000 of his own countrymen as political prisoners to silence their opposition. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, and he suspended newspapers that dared oppose him. His countrymen repaid him with draft riots in New York, massive desertions from his armies, and a rebellious underground Copperhead movement which was present in every northern state. There was scarcely a northern state that didn't have its own armed battles between pro- and anti-Lincoln factions. Lincoln surrounded himself with a galaxy of men of doubtful reputation, each his own selection. Sumner in his cabinet, the brutal, cold-hearted extremist, Grant, the hard-drinking general who issued orders to burn every citizen's house and dwelling within 10 miles of any train derailment in Northern Virginia. This was the same Grant who refused to issue orders to protect Virginia's civilians behind his lines. Thieving and rapacious soldiers could enter any private dwelling at will, take anything, and do anything they liked to the occupants. Seldom was there disciplinary action. On occasion, officers of the lower ranks did what they could to protect civilians, but this was the exception. It did not extend to those in higher authority. Mr. Lincoln knew of this condition. General Custer hanged Confederate cavalrymen until the hanging of his own men in reprisal put a stop to it. He received no reprimand. Sheridan burned the Valley of Virginia after Confederate troops had left. Nothing was said about this either. From the beginning of the war, Northern and Southern prisoners of war were exchanged as a humanitarian act to prevent the rigors of prisoners of war camps. This practice was ordered stopped. A delegation of hungry and sick Northern officers at Belle Isle Prison near Richmond were released on their word of honor so that they could go to Washington to beg Lincoln to reinstate prisoner exchanges. At this very time, Lincoln's own sons were safely holding down desk jobs in Washington far from the dangers of the front lines. Lincoln refused these men's petition. Lincoln was apprised of the fact that captured Southern soldiers were placed in the most exposed prisoner of war camps with little shelter, almost no blankets and clothing to cope with the frigid weather, had little food, and that African Americans were placed over them for guards. These guards were encouraged to do what they liked to the prisoners. Lincoln knew this. He was also aware of what Sherman was doing in the Deep South. Sherman was not only removed from his command, he continued to receive honors from Lincoln. The argument cannot be made that he did not know what was going on. He stayed in my great-grandfather's house at Kelly's Ford. With his own eyes, he saw the crimes of his soldiers to the very place he was staying and had others pointed out to him. He said nothing and turned away. This is the Lincoln the system has portrayed as a soft-hearted, sensitive, lonely man who tried to prevent the bloodbath that inundated America. The law states, quote, "Can two walk together except they be agreed?" Amos, chapter 3, verse 3. His apologists say that he would have made things different had he lived. Perhaps our merciful God spared his children the rest of the Lincoln story.